Get out of my way, you useless little worm. The harsh voice, dripping with contempt, sliced through the elegant atmosphere of the Savoy Hotel's grand ballroom like a blade. Tyson Fury, who had been chatting quietly with Evangeline Hartwell about his foundation for children with mental health issues, stopped mid-sentence. His eyes immediately turned towards the source of the disturbance. In the corner of the ballroom, near the bar decorated with white and gold flowers, Percival Thornwell, an imposing businessman dressed in an impeccable dinner jacket, was aggressively shoving Mortimer Blackwood, a young waiter who had accidentally spilled a few drops of champagne on Thornwell's £1,000 Italian shoes. "You should be washing dishes, not serving important people," Thornwell continued, his voice rising as he pointed his index finger directly at the young man's face. "People like you shouldn't even be here." Mortimer, visibly frightened with trembling hands, tried to apologize repeatedly. "Sorry, sir. It was an accident. I can clean it." "Shut up," Thornwell interrupted brutally, shoving him again, this time causing the young man to stumble and nearly drop a tray of canapes. The ballroom, which moments before had been filled with animated conversations among the 200 guests at the charity event, began to fall silent. People stopped talking, glasses were lowered, and all eyes turned to the embarrassing scene. Cordelia Fairfax, who had been taking notes for her article about the event, looked up in surprise. Barnaby Whitmore instinctively raised his camera, sensing that something important was about to happen. Tyson Fury felt a familiar wave of indignation rise in his chest. It wasn't explosive anger, but rather that cold, calculated determination he knew well from the boxing ring. He had grown up facing bullies, had experienced difficult times in life, and knew exactly how that young waiter was feeling at that moment. The heavyweight champion stood up from his table, his 6'9" frame commanding immediate attention from those nearby. Evangeline Hartwell looked at him with concern, recognizing the steel in his eyes that she'd seen in interviews when he discussed serious topics. "Excuse me," Tyson said quietly to Evangeline, placing his napkin on the table with deliberate care. "I need to handle something." As he walked across the ballroom floor, conversations ceased entirely. The click of his dress shoes against the marble created a rhythmic soundtrack that seemed to announce his approach. Other guests began to turn, some recognizing the famous boxer, others simply drawn by his commanding presence. Percival Thornwell was still berating the young waiter when Tyson approached. "Perhaps," Tyson said in his distinctive Morecambe accent, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute authority, "we could handle this differently." Thornwell spun around, his face flushed with anger and alcohol. When he saw who had spoken, his expression shifted slightly, recognizing the heavyweight champion but not showing any signs of backing down. "This doesn't concern you, Mr. Fury," Thornwell said, his tone condescending. "This incompetent fool has ruined my evening, and I'm simply ensuring he understands the consequences of his carelessness." Tyson positioned himself between Thornwell and Mortimer, not aggressively, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to prove his physical capabilities through intimidation. "The young man has apologized," Tyson said evenly. "Accidents happen. I'm happy to cover any cleaning costs for your shoes." The ballroom had become completely silent now. Even the serving staff had stopped moving, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere around the unfolding drama. Cordelia Fairfax was frantically scribbling notes, while Barnaby Whitmore continued capturing the scene through his lens. "This isn't about money," Thornwell snapped, his voice carrying across the now silent room. "It's about standards, about knowing one's place. Some people simply don't belong in establishments like this." Tyson's expression remained calm, but those who knew him well would have recognized the subtle tightening around his eyes. "And what place would that be exactly?" he asked, his tone still measured, but with an edge that made several nearby guests shift uncomfortably. Mortimer stood behind Tyson, still trembling, but now with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. The young waiter had probably never imagined that someone like Tyson Fury would step in to defend him. "Look," Tyson continued, addressing both men, but speaking loudly enough for the surrounding crowd to hear, "we're all here tonight for the same reason, to support children who need our help. Perhaps we could focus on that instead of making a scene over spilled champagne." Evangeline Hartwell watched from her table, torn between admiration for Tyson's intervention and concern about how it might affect the event. She had organized dozens of charity galas, but had never witnessed anything quite like this. Thornwell's face grew redder, and it became clear that Tyson's reasonable approach was only fueling his anger, rather than diffusing it. "Don't lecture me about charity, Mr. Fury," he said, his voice now loud enough to carry across the entire ballroom. "I've contributed more to worthy causes than you've earned in your entire career." The The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Several guests gasped audibly, while others leaned forward, anticipating Tyson's response. This was no longer just about a spilled drink. It had become something much more significant. Tyson smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but I've never felt the need to humiliate a young man to make myself feel important." The tension in the room was now palpable. Thornwell's hands were clenched into fists, though he was clearly intelligent enough not to physically challenge a heavyweight boxing champion. Mortimer remained frozen behind Tyson, caught between gratitude and terror about what might happen next. Barnaby Whitmore moved closer, sensing that this moment would define the entire evening. Through his camera lens, he could see the contrast between Tyson's calm dignity and Thornwell's barely contained rage. As the standoff continued, it became clear that this was about much more than an accident with champagne. This was about power, respect, and what it truly meant to be a champion, both inside and outside the ring. Percival Thornwell's face had turned an alarming shade of purple, and the veins in his temples were visibly throbbing. The reasonable approach that Tyson Fury had attempted was clearly not going to work with this man. If anything, the businessman seemed to interpret Tyson's calm demeanor as a sign of weakness rather than strength. "You think you can intimidate me?" Thornwell hissed, stepping closer to Tyson despite the significant difference in their physical stature. "I've been dealing with brutes like you my entire career, all muscle, no brain. You may be able to punch people in a ring, but this is the real world, where intelligence and influence matter more than your primitive skills." The insult echoed across the silent ballroom. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others seemed almost excited by the unfolding drama. Cordelia Fairfax was writing furiously, knowing she was witnessing something that would make headlines across the country. Tyson's expression remained unchanged, but those who knew him could see the subtle shift in his posture. He was no longer just intervening in a dispute. He was being personally attacked in front of 200 influential people. "Mr. Thornwell," Evangeline Hartwell called out from her table, her voice carrying a note of warning. "Perhaps we should all take a moment to remember why we're here tonight." But Thornwell was beyond listening to reason. The alcohol, combined with what he clearly perceived as a challenge to his authority, had pushed him past the point of rational behavior. "Don't you dare tell me what to remember," he snapped at Evangeline before turning back to Tyson. "And you, Mr. So-called champion, need to learn that your reputation means nothing outside of your little boxing world." Mortimer, still standing behind Tyson, looked as though he wanted to disappear entirely. The young man was clearly mortified that his simple accident had escalated into this public confrontation. His hands were shaking so badly that he had to clasp them together to stop the trembling. "Sir," Mortimer whispered, addressing Thornwell directly, "please, I'll pay for the shoes myself. I'll work extra shifts. I just need this job." Thornwell's eyes lit up with a cruel gleam. Here was an opportunity to demonstrate his power in front of the entire room. "Pay for them?" He laughed harshly. "These shoes cost more than you make in 3 months, but that's not the point anymore." He turned to address the room, his voice carrying with the confidence of a man accustomed to being the center of attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think you should all know what kind of establishment you're supporting. They hire incompetent staff who can't perform the simplest tasks without causing damage." Tyson felt his jaw tighten. This was no longer about resolving a conflict. Thornwell was deliberately trying to destroy a young man's livelihood for his own entertainment. "Furthermore," Thornwell continued, warming to his theme, "I will personally ensure that this individual never works in any respectable establishment in London again. I have connections throughout the hospitality industry, and I will make certain that his carelessness follows him wherever he goes." The threat hung in the air like a physical presence. Several staff members around the room looked visibly distressed, clearly understanding the implications of such a threat from someone with Thornwell's obvious influence and connections. Tyson stepped forward, his movement causing Thornwell to instinctively step back. "That's enough," Tyson said, his voice still controlled but carrying a new edge that made everyone in the room pay attention. "You've made your point about the shoes. Leave the lad alone." "Leave him alone?" Thornwell laughed, but there was a nervous quality to it now. "This is exactly what's wrong with society today. No consequences for failure. No standards. People like him drag down the quality of everything they touch." Barnaby Whitmore was moving around the confrontation now, capturing different angles of the scene. Through his lens, he could see the stark contrast between the two men, Tyson's controlled strength versus Thornwell's brittle arrogance. "You know what I think," Thornwell continued, emboldened by what he mistook for Tyson's restraint. "I think famous athletes like you are just as much of the problem. You get paid ridiculous amounts of money to engage in barbaric spectacles, and then you think that gives you the right to lecture civilized people about behavior. The room collectively held its breath. Thornwell had crossed a line that went beyond the original incident, beyond even his threats against Mortimer. He was now attacking Tyson personally, questioning his character and his right to be treated with respect. Cordelia Fairfax stopped writing and looked up, realizing that she was about to witness either an explosive confrontation or something entirely unexpected. The energy in the room had shifted dramatically, and she could sense that whatever happened next would define not just this evening, but potentially how this story would be remembered for years to come. Tyson was silent for a long moment, and in that silence the tension became almost unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that people had to strain to hear him. "Mr. Thornwell," he said, "I think you've said quite enough for one evening." But Thornwell, perhaps sensing that he had pushed the famous boxer to a breaking point, seemed determined to press his advantage. "Have I?" he asked with a sneer. "Or have I simply said what everyone in this room is thinking, that someone like you doesn't belong in civilized company any more than this clumsy waiter does?" The final insult seemed to crystallize something in the room. Even those guests who might have initially sided with Thornwell now looked uncomfortable with the direction he had taken the confrontation. He had gone from being an angry customer to something much uglier. Mortimer was now visibly crying, though he was trying to hide it. The humiliation and the threat to his future employment had clearly overwhelmed him. Several other staff members looked on with obvious distress, knowing that they could easily find themselves in his position. Evangeline Hartwell stood up from her table, clearly preparing to intervene more directly, but Tyson held up a hand to stop her. He had made a decision about how to handle this situation, and it was going to surprise everyone in the room. What happened next would be talked about for years to come, shared across social media millions of times, and cited as an example of grace under pressure in leadership seminars around the world. Instead of responding to Percival Thornwell's provocations with anger or physical intimidation, Tyson Fury did something completely unexpected. He took a deep breath, his shoulders visibly relaxing as he made a conscious decision that would surprise everyone in the room. He turned away from Thornwell entirely and walked with measured steps toward the small stage at the front of the ballroom, where the evening's speakers had been presenting throughout the night. The ornate chandeliers cast dramatic shadows across Tyson's face as he moved through the crowd. Guests instinctively stepped aside, creating a natural pathway. Some reached out to touch his arm supportively, others whispered words of encouragement. The room buzzed with confused murmurs and speculation about what the heavyweight champion was planning to do. Evangeline Hartwell, who had been watching the entire confrontation with growing concern from her position at the head table, felt her heart racing. As the event organizer, she was responsible for maintaining the evening's dignity and purpose. When Tyson reached the stage and looked in her direction with a questioning expression, she hesitated for only a moment before nodding her permission. She had no idea what he was planning, but something in his demeanor suggested wisdom rather than recklessness. The sound system crackled slightly as Tyson adjusted the microphone to accommodate his considerable height. The crystal glasses on nearby tables caught the light as guests shifted in their seats, creating tiny prisms of reflected illumination across the walls. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tyson began, his distinctive Morecambe accent carrying clearly through the sound system, reaching every corner of the vast ballroom. "I hope you'll forgive this interruption to what has been a wonderful evening, but I think we've all just witnessed something that deserves a thoughtful response." The transformation in the room was immediate and complete. Conversations ceased mid-sentence, cutlery was set down with delicate precision, and even the serving staff stopped their movements. Even Thornwell, who had been preparing for a very different kind of confrontation, found himself staring at the stage in confusion, his earlier bluster temporarily forgotten. "My name is Tyson Fury, and like many of you here tonight, I've had my struggles in life." His voice was steady, conversational, intimate despite addressing 200 strangers in formal evening wear. "I've battled depression, faced personal demons that nearly destroyed me, and yes, I've been bullied. I felt powerless, worthless, and completely alone." He paused, allowing his eyes to sweep across the audience, making genuine contact with individual faces. Several guests nodded in recognition, some dabbing at their eyes with linen napkins. "When I was younger, much younger than I care to admit, there were people who made me feel exactly like that young man over there feels right now." He gestured with genuine compassion toward Mortimer, who remained standing near the bar, tears creating visible tracks down his flushed cheeks. Small, worthless, like I didn't belong in the same space as decent people. Cordelia Fairfax had stopped taking her usual rapid notes, and was simply listening, her pen suspended above her notepad. She realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, something that transcended typical celebrity behavior or public relations gestures. This was raw, authentic humanity being displayed by someone who had every reason to respond with aggression. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. What had begun as an embarrassing spectacle was transforming into something profound. Guests were leaning forward, genuinely engaged with Tyson's words, rather than merely waiting for the drama to conclude. But I learned something important over the years, something that changed how I see myself and how I treat others, Tyson continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction. Real strength isn't about making other people feel small so you can feel big. Real power isn't about using your influence, your money, or your connections to destroy someone's livelihood over an honest mistake. Real champions, whether in the ring or in life, lift people up. They don't tear them down. He paused again, this time for dramatic effect, letting his words resonate through the ornate ballroom. The silence was so complete that the sound of London traffic from the street below seemed unusually loud. Then, in a gesture that surprised even his supporters, Tyson extended his hand toward Mortimer and smiled encouragingly. "Young man, would you please join me up here?" Mortimer looked terrified, his face pale except for the red marks where tears had fallen. Several guests began encouraging him with gentle applause that grew steadily louder. Lady Pemberton, an elderly aristocrat known for her charitable work, stood and began clapping more enthusiastically. Her gesture prompted others to follow suit, until the entire room was offering genuine support to the young waiter. Slowly, hesitantly, Mortimer made his way through the crowd toward the stage. Staff members he worked with smiled at him supportively, and several guests reached out to pat his shoulder as he passed. When he reached the stage, Tyson helped him up with genuine kindness. "This young man," Tyson said, placing a protective hand on Mortimer's shoulder while addressing the crowd, "has been working diligently all evening to ensure that each of you has had a wonderful experience. He's been polite, professional, and dedicated to his job. He made one small mistake, the kind that every single person in this room has made countless times, and instead of receiving the understanding that any human being deserves, he's been threatened, humiliated, and had his future livelihood placed in jeopardy." The contrast was striking and intentional. On the stage stood two men representing vastly different worlds, one a world-famous athlete worth millions of pounds, the other a young waiter probably earning minimum wage and struggling to make ends meet in expensive London. Yet, Tyson was treating Mortimer not as a charity case or a prop, but as an equal human being deserving of dignity and respect. "I want to tell you all something important about people like Mortimer," Tyson continued, his voice carrying genuine warmth and conviction. "Without hard-working, dedicated individuals like him, events like this simply couldn't happen. The glamour you see, the elegance you're enjoying, the seamless success of this entire evening, it all depends on people who often go unnoticed, unappreciated, and certainly underpaid for the value they provide." From his position in the audience, Barnaby Whitmore was moving carefully around the room, capturing every angle of this unprecedented scene. Through his camera lens, he could see not just the obvious subjects, but the faces of the guests, the reactions of the staff, the transformation taking place in real time. He understood instinctively that these photographs would become iconic, that the image of Tyson Fury defending a young waiter would resonate far beyond this single evening. Then Tyson did something that stunned even Evangeline Hartwell, who thought she had seen everything in her years of organizing high-profile charity events. Instead of concluding his speech with inspiring generalities, he turned his attention directly toward Thornwell, who was still standing near the bar, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the attention of the entire room focused on him with laser intensity. "Mr. Thornwell," Tyson said, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom without any hint of mockery or aggression, "you're clearly a successful man who has achieved remarkable things in your career. You have influence, connections, and the demonstrated ability to affect people's lives in significant ways. That's not just success, that's tremendous responsibility." Thornwell's face had transformed from red to an alarming pale color. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely as he began to understand that this situation had moved far beyond his control or comprehension. "I'd like to offer you something," Tyson continued, his tone remaining respectful but carrying an underlying firmness that commanded attention. "I'd like to offer you an opportunity to show everyone here what true leadership actually looks like. I'm going to ask you to consider doing two things, but I want to be clear that these are requests, not demands." The room had become so quiet that individual sounds became magnified, the gentle hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic, the rustle of expensive fabric as people shifted in their seats. First, I'd like you to consider making a significant additional donation to tonight's charity, perhaps matching or even doubling whatever amount you were already planning to contribute. Second, and more importantly, I'd like you to consider offering a sincere public apology to Mortimer for the treatment he received this evening. This was not what anyone had expected. The guests had anticipated either a physical confrontation or a verbal assault that would humiliate Thornwell in return for his behavior. Instead, Tyson was offering him something much more valuable and much more difficult, a path to redemption. "But here's the crucial thing I want everyone to understand," Tyson added, his tone remaining gentle but gaining intensity. "This isn't a demand backed by threats or intimidation. This isn't about revenge or public humiliation. This is an invitation. You have a choice, Mr. Thornwell. You can choose to be remembered as someone who used his considerable power and influence to build people up, to set an example of grace and leadership, or you can choose to be remembered as someone who used those same gifts to tear down a young man whose only crime was a minor accident." He paused, letting the weight of that choice settle over the room like a blanket. "The choice is entirely yours, and whatever you decide, it will define not just how this evening ends, but how you'll be remembered by everyone who witnessed these events." Thornwell stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Every eye in the room was focused on him, waiting to see what he would do with this unexpected opportunity for redemption. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, filled with tension and anticipation. Finally, slowly, Thornwell began walking toward the stage. His steps were hesitant, uncertain, his face displaying a complex mixture of embarrassment, confusion, and what might have been relief. When he reached the microphone, his usually commanding voice was barely audible, shaking with genuine emotion. I owe you a sincere apology, Mortimer," he said, his voice cracking with what sounded like genuine remorse. "My behavior tonight was completely unacceptable. I was angry, I was drinking, and I took out my frustrations on you in a way that was cruel and unfair. I'm truly sorry." He turned to address the entire room, his voice gaining slightly more strength. "And I'd like to announce an additional donation of £50,000 to tonight's charity in honor of the lesson I've learned this evening." The response was immediate, overwhelming, and genuine. The entire ballroom erupted in sustained applause, not just for the substantial donation, but for the transformation they had all witnessed. Thornwell, who mere minutes before had been the clear villain of the evening, had found a way to redeem himself through genuine remorse and meaningful action. Tyson stepped back to the microphone for what everyone sensed would be his final words of the evening. "This is what real strength looks like," he said, gesturing to include both Mortimer and Thornwell in his statement. "Not the ability to knock someone down, whether physically or emotionally, but the wisdom and courage to help them back up. We're all human beings, we all make mistakes, and we all deserve the chance to learn, to grow, and to do better." As the applause continued, growing even stronger, Evangeline Hartwell found herself wiping tears from her eyes with her napkin. She realized that this evening had accomplished something far more valuable than raising money for charity. Important as that was, it had provided everyone present with a lesson in human dignity, in the power of choosing compassion over cruelty that would be remembered and shared long after the last guest had returned home. The video of Tyson's speech, captured by Barnaby Whitmore's skilled photography and the smartphones of dozens of guests, would indeed go viral within hours. It would be viewed by millions of people around the world and shared across every social media platform as a perfect example of how to transform conflict into compassion, how to use influence responsibly, and how true champions are measured not by their ability to destroy their opponents, but by their capacity to heal divisions and build bridges between people.